بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear respected brothers and sisters, maybe brothers listening at home as well. Alhamdulillah, it's a delight to be back. Even after the intermission, it just feels like there was an empty gap in between, but it's good to be filling that in. Because you need that constant flow of knowledge in. And just one point that I read about history, if you want to really become not even an expert, just even an amateur at history, then historical facts and data have to be what they say, your mental oxygen. So you have to keep on breathing in just little bits at a time. And if you don't, then your knowledge base, your critical knowledge base will suffocate, just like you suffocate without any oxygen. So hopefully, inshallah, today, because we've not got I'm not going to say we don't have any time restrictions, because I don't want it to go all the way up until 12 at night. But we'll cap it, inshallah, maybe 1 hour, 20 minutes, but let's try to recuperate what we missed out from last week. So very quickly, I think if we can challenge ourselves to a quick 5-minute recap, because I know we've literally been meandering and twisting and turning from Indian history, starting at the Prophet's time all the way till, well, wherever we are now. So just to consolidate all of that so we know where we are. The first thing we talked about, 629, we demythologized the story of Cheraman Perumal from Kerala. Yeah, so we can say, not with certainty because the sources are quite vague and obscure, but we can say that he existed, but not at the time of the Prophet. Did he make his way to Mecca and meet the Prophet and Medina? No. Did he ever make his way to the Arabian Peninsula? Yes. Was that at the Prophet's time? No. When was that? Probably maybe around the 8th or 9th century. Did he ever make it back to India? Probably not. Did he die in the Arabian Peninsula? Probably so, somewhere near Mecca. So again, it's still clouded in mystery. And like we said, the first mention of him in any book of history, in any chronicle, was in roughly 1510 by a Portuguese explorer and naval officer in India as well. And then later on, there was another scholar, Tuhfatul Mujahideen, a native scholar to Kerala. And when I actually consulted the primary source, he actually says it's still shrouded in mystery. So we don't know for sure. And I remember somebody sent me an article afterwards, after we talked about Cheraman Perumal. And it was an article saying Ibn Hajar, for the scholars, Ibn Hajar has actually talked about him in one of his books called Al-Isaba fi Tamyiz al-Sahaba, which is a biography on companions. So somebody said he's mentioned this Indian king in Al-Isaba under an alias, under another name, but referring to this Cheraman Perumal from Kerala. So and they were making out as if Ibn Hajar was in support, and this was evidence. So when I actually consulted again Al-Isaba, then he mentions it, Ibn Hajar, and right after that he quotes Imam Zahabi from his Tajreed saying, إِنَّهُ كِذْبٌ وَاضِحٌ. It's completely fabricated, no basis whatsoever. And then he quotes a few scholars as well. Yeah, so again, just another, we say that the Hindu nationalists, they're also peddling their own agenda, but sometimes us Muslims can succumb to and be the victims to misinformation when it comes to history, just because it sounds nice, doesn't it? Wow, you've got the first king to become a Muslim was from India, that's why we should all invest in India. And to be fair, it's probably just a myth which was perpetuated and then churned out by the Grand Mosque in Kerala, the Jami Mosque. And actually outside they've got a plaque saying that it was established by a famous successor, Malik ibn Dinar, under the orders of Cheraman Perumal. So it's just a publicity act, and it's quite a hotspot tourist destination as well. So anyway, we demythologize that. Later on, skip all the way to the era of Umar radiallahu anh, when he was a caliph. Uthman radiallahu anh from Ta'if. Uthman Thaqafi, he made him the governor of Ta'if, and then he was moved to Bahrain, and then he orchestrated a two-pronged attack, more of a raid and incursion. On the one hand, his brother Hakam radiallahu anh, he was sent to modern-day Bharuch and Bombay, and then his other brother Mughira was then sent off to modern-day Karachi. Debal was the historical name. But again, they didn't want to set up a stronghold or a power base in India. It was more just a quick raid, expedition, and then move your forces back. Then we jump to 711. This is the first proper major incursion. Again, it's still an incursion because they didn't want to set up a native power base in India. Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, 711. He was actually 17 years old, and he was the nephew of the famous, notorious Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the Iraqi governor of the Umayyads. And he won, he defeated Raja Dahir, he had 5,000 Syrian cavalrymen with him, and then he pulled his forces back. And now Sindh, the modern day province of Sindh in Pakistan is now under Muslim control, nominal Muslim control. And you had Arabian governors there. And remember, like we said, because it was so far away from the caliphal capitals of Damascus and then Baghdad, it was financially untenable for the Muslims to support more conquest in Sindh. And because it was so far away, it was difficult for them to then divert resources there. So that's why it stayed on the periphery. It stayed on the fringes, on the outlines, on the borders of the Muslim state. That all changed with Mahmud Ghaznavi in around 998. And he was actually the son of the progenitor, of the founder of his new Ghaznavid state called Sabuktajin. And he was then a slave who was part of the Samanid corps. He was a general, and he established his own power base in Ghazna, modern-day Afghanistan. And he made a few raids into India, but it was his son who actually peddled and who led the charge from the front into India. And he actually made an oath that he's going to raid India at least once every year, as long as he's the Sultan. And actually, he was the first person ever, the first leader, Muslim person ever to be given and accorded the title Sultan. That means he's now being invested with authority, not from anyone, but from the Caliph in Baghdad, to carry out and enact warfare in his name. So he's got the written charter behind him now. So he's got all the political clout and weight that he needs to now conduct warfare in the name of the Caliph. And that's what Sultan is, just to make a distinction. You're probably thinking, what's the difference between a Khalifa, a Caliph, and a Sultan? Sultan has been anglicized, so Sultan is an English word as well now. The difference is, if somebody says, I'm a Caliph, like the Fatimids in Egypt, or the Umayyads in Cordoba in Spain, that means they're now laying claim to this religious position of the Caliph, somebody who was then linked back to the Prophet ﷺ in a long line of religious leaders. Somebody who has political leadership and religious leadership. That's a Caliph. A Sultan is somebody who says, I just have power. Sultan comes from the word authority, meaning I just have authority in the land. So he has power, he has an army, he has a military, he might have a state as well. But he doesn't lay claim to religious authority. That's the difference. So you'll never hear anybody calling a Caliph a Sultan. They're not interchangeable, just bear that in mind. They're not synonyms as well. So a Caliph is a Caliph. He might be a Sultan as well, but he's a Caliph. A Sultan will not be a Caliph. He doesn't claim to be a Caliph. So Mahmud Ghaznavi, he didn't say, I'm breaking away from the Abbasids. What did he say? I'm still a subject. I'm still a subordinate of the Abbasids. I'm going to carry out warfare in the name of the Abbasids. He had his 17 raids into India, and we can say, for the most part, he was driven by financial motives, because the temples in India were filled and replete with gold and treasures and wealth. Like we said, when he raided and plundered the Somnath temple in Gujarat, 1026, the temple of Shiva, as it was dedicated to, he came back with treasure worth 20 million gold coins. Now, where are you going to find that sort of wealth in the Muslim lands? So that's why he looked to the Far East in India, and he saw opportunity, and he brought it back with him. Now, again, he didn't set up his power base in India. He came back. He had his staging ground in Lahore, modern-day Pakistan, which is called Mahmudpur, the city of Mahmud. But that was just his frontal command. His main capital was still in Afghanistan, in Ghazni, and he pulled back his forces. Mahmud Ghaznavi died in around 1030, and he was succeeded by weak, ineffective rulers who lost a large portion and majority of Ghaznavid territory to the up-and-coming Seljuks, who were the predecessors of the Sultan, of the Ottoman Sultanate, and then the Caliphate afterwards. And to be fair, they just fizzled out of existence and out of fame later on. It's actually a miracle that the Ghaznavid state actually managed to last all the way up until 1186. Even though 1030, they lost most of their power with the death of Mahmud, when he died, so did their power. But they managed to last all the way up until then, because they remained largely inactive on the political scene. They just were happy and content with their small little power base in Lahore, which is called Mini Ghazna. Now we move on to 1186. We move on to our next dynasty. Just firstly, if we move on to the first slide. So remember, like we said, and I've been given the rubber stamp by the event organizers, but I thought I'd just run it past, obviously, the attendees here. We will be adding a fifth session on, just because I think we did go on a bit of a tangent in the first two sessions about Indian history, and we haven't even started Mughals yet, but when we do, then we'll try and shorten it down, truncate it to the main parts. And I felt as if we'd be doing a disservice to Aurangzeb if we didn't dedicate an entire session to him. I think the man himself deserves, it's only fair and justice from us if we give him an entire session. Then the last one, I've actually renamed it, the Lesser Mughals and EIC. Does anybody have any idea what EIC might stand for? East India Company. Yeah? In actual fact, they went through many different phases, East India Company. They were a trading company supported by the British Crown to trade in India. And then they just evolved into a monster of a mega corporation. The first name they were given is actually, it's just a mouthful to say it in and of itself. The first name they were given, not East India Company, it was the Governor and Company of, the Governor and Trading Company of London, trading with the West Indies. That was the entire name. It was shortened later on to East India Company. They actually eclipse and overshadow the Mughals. That's why we have to talk about them. I mean, we can't talk about the decline of the Mughals whilst we neglect the British. They were instrumental, actually. So that's what we hope to do. So if we can just carry on with the slides. And you've got a quick recap here. Yeah, we can move on from there. And Islamic history, when we talked about that we can carry on going. I'll tell you when to stop and carry on all the way. Yeah, so hopefully this just jogs your memory a bit. And now we want to stop at next one and stop there. Okay, one back, please. The Delhi Sultanate. Yeah, so remember the Delhi Sultanate is made up of actually 5 sub-dynasties and 5 sub-families. And they were all actually grouped into the category of slave rulers because they were all slaves of higher dynasties who wrestled power for themselves. But the thing is, we can't talk about the Delhi Sultanate first because there was another predecessor state. Yeah, and the thing is, with history, that's why when I thought to myself, we can't talk about the Mughals if we don't talk about the Delhi Sultanate. Then I thought, we can't talk about the Delhi Sultanate if we don't talk about their predecessors. And then the Ghaznavids. Everything then joins together. And it's like a whole massive puzzle. So if there's a break anywhere, then you'll have deficiency in understanding a certain concept when it comes to the Mughals. Because the Mughals, they were the last Muslim dynasty in India. And they were an amalgamation of everything. All the Muslim dynasties up until that moment were encapsulated within the Mughals. They stood for and represented the entire Muslim tradition in India, political tradition before them. Okay, so the Ghaznavids, they had successors known as the Ghurids. I've not added it there. They're called the Ghurids, and their stronghold was in Ghur, modern-day Afghanistan. They were Eastern Iranian in origin, and like the Ghaznavids, they also ruled from their stronghold in Afghanistan. Now, they started taking land from the Afghanistan dynasty, meaning the Ghaznavids, in 1040, when Mahmud's son, Mas'ud, died. So 1040, then they slowly built up. They were a small start-up family-run business that evolved into a dynasty. And they carried on encroaching on Ghaznavid land and consuming it. On the one hand, you had the Ghurids who were taking Ghaznavid land in the east, and then the Seljuks were taking Ghaznavid land from the west. Now, in 1186, this is, you could say, keep this date in mind, 1186 is when the last Ghaznavid ruler was deposed. And you could say that was the end of the Ghaznavid state. And they were actually conquered by the Ghurids. The Ghurids conquered Lahore. Remember, Ghazni was way out of their territory. Ghazni had already been lost. They had to relocate to Lahore. Lahore was taken in 1186, and the last Ghaznavid sultan and leader, Khusro Malik, was deposed. Now the Ghurids are in charge. They're the new kid on the block. They're the new power here in Afghanistan. They were the first dynasty to rule India from India. The first people to rule India from within India. And which city was that? The famed city of Delhi, the historical city of Delhi. It wasn't all rosy and red from the get-go. Muhammad al-Ghur, he was, you could say, the progenitor and the founder of the Delhi Sultanate. He actually was the predecessor. It was his slave who was the founder. So in 1192, Muhammad al-Ghur, Shihabuddin Ghuri was his name. And he then wanted to move eastwards into India. Northern India at this time was under the control of a Hindu warrior king. Now remember, this warrior clan, this caste of Hindu warriors is going to constantly reappear and re-emerge. So let's get it out of the way now. The Rajput warriors. The Rajput warriors were a Hindu caste, a lower class, but they were a warrior people. They had a relentless spirit of warfare. And they always caused problems for every single Muslim dynasty to enter into India. And they were natives of Rajasthan. Rajasthan is in modern day North India. So the ruler of North India was a Rajput Hindu warrior king called Prithvi Raj Chauhan. Prithvi Raj Chauhan. He was in charge. His power base was actually in modern-day Ajmer. That was his capital. That was his state. He was the one who was in control of northern India. Muhammad al-Ghur set his sight on India, and his first target was the territory of Prithvi Raj Chauhan. And in 1191, he made his first incursion, and the first battle of Tarain took place. And now, Muhammad al-Ghur, he has light archers, and his army was made up of Turkic slave soldiers. His entire army was made up of these Turkic regiments bought from Central Asia. Just like the Samanids supplied the Abbasids with Turkic soldiers, just like the Samanids themselves had their own Turkic soldiers, that's where Sabuktajin came from. Now you've got Muhammad al-Ghur, Ghurids, following in that tradition, Central Asian tradition. His army is now made up of these Turkic warriors. And just a quick digression here, over the course of Muslim history, you can probably narrow the main characters of our Muslim history to three ethnicities. The Arabs, number one, the Persians, number two, and then the Turks. The Arabs were the founding fathers, you could say. Nobody can deny the special place that Arabs hold in a Muslim's heart, and in Islam as well. The Persians were always the classy, sophisticated ones. They had all the finesse, they had all the culture behind them. They had all the intellect. They were the bureaucrats. They were the politicians. The Abbasids, they employed the Persians as the politicians. Every single Central Asian state modeled their political makeup according to the Abbasids. And the Abbasids, who did they draw major influence from? The Persians. That's why a lot of the Ottoman administration has its roots in Seljuk administration. The Seljuks, who was their main vizier? Nizam al-Mulk. Everybody's heard of him. Nizam al-Mulk. And he was of Persian origin. People used to say the Turks are too brutish, the Turks are too unruly, the Turks are uncivilized, but they're warriors. The Persians, they don't want to get their hands dirty on the battlefield, so they'll take the high palaces and their ivory towers and they'll command and civilize the Turks. So it was a formidable marriage between the Turks and then the Persians. So the Turks were the warriors. They're known as the samurais of the Muslims. And they were specialists in archery, in horsemanship and cavalry joined together. Now imagine what a formidable combination that is, to have archers on horseback. That's who the Turks were. And they were experts in handling composite bows. So imagine you've got archers who are mobile, fast sprinting horsemen, cavalry horsemen, and that's what Muhammad al-Ghur had in his army. The first battle of Tarain, he unfortunately lost. And because his army were too quick, his horsemen, Prithvi Raj Chauhan couldn't pursue him and couldn't finish off the job. So he went back to his stronghold in Afghanistan and he made a vow, I'm going to come back next year, I'm going to build a whole new army. He actually deposed all of his captains who failed to win the battle. He relinquished all of them from their posts and he brought in a whole new, complete change of guard. He brought in a whole new army and he said, next year I'm going to try and take northern India again. Then in 1192, he launched the second battle. The second battle of Tarain, and this was resounding success. There were actually 50,000 Ghurid soldiers and 100,000 of Prithvi Raj Chauhan soldiers. And he had 300 elephants, armored elephants. He had his own armored elephant corps. Like you have tanks, they had elephants as well. And it was actually interesting what he did was, and again, this just puts things into perspective. Muslim history wasn't all rosy and red. It wasn't all utopian and picturesque. Prithvi Raj Chauhan, before the battle started, he thought, look, I've already psychologically defeated him from the last war. Maybe I can use that to my advantage. So he sent a very threatening letter warning him that if you don't surrender, then I'm going to completely decimate your forces. If you do, then I'll let you return back to your lands. So Muhammad al-Ghur, he now deceived his enemy on the battlefield, even though debatable whether it was permissible or not. Now, if you want to gauge the permissibility of anything, all you have to do is refer it back to what the Prophet did and what his noble companions did. Yeah, so we'll just talk about this first, then we'll refer back to what the companions would have done in that situation. So he received the letter and he thought, you know what, let me use it to my advantage. So he pacified Chauhan. He said, you know what, he pretended to be submissive and scared of this threat. And with a submissive tone, he said, you know what, I'm going to pull back my forces. So Prithvi Raj Chauhan, he thought he was happy. That's it, he's going back to his own homeland. So he let his troops rest for the night. Then this ruse actually managed to lull Chauhan into a false sense of security. And the Ghurids launched a night attack. And they completely caught his forces unaware. Caught them with their pants down, literally. They were all sleeping. And the next day when the battle ensued, he destroyed the Chauhan forces, 100,000. Now, he'd already made a sort of an agreement. So from his point of view, it would have been justified because I need to take northern India. Warfare is all about deception. That's what he would have said. If you talk about the companions, what would they have done? Just very quickly, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, he was fighting the Byzantines. And he made a truce with the Byzantines. We're not going to fight. There was a ceasefire, cease all hostilities. So Muawiyah thought, let me take advantage, and in the meantime, let me position my troops on the Byzantine border. I'm not even backing on the treaty. I'm not disobeying it. I'm not being treacherous. I'm not betraying it. All I'm doing is I'm positioning my troops on the Byzantine border. So as soon as the ceasefire ends the next morning, I can then send my forces in straight away. So as he was mobilizing his cavalrymen, his famed Syrian cavalrymen, one companion came running, shouting Allahu Akbar, grabbing the attention of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. And he told Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he issued severe warnings against people who are treacherous and betray their oaths that they make even with the enemy. And Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, he was then alerted to his so-called treacherous ways, and he said, you know what, I'm going to pull back my forces. And he pulled all of his forces back, just to honor a treaty that he had with the enemy. So that's now a benchmark that we can use to gauge later Muslims. What would the companions have done in that situation? It might be speculative, but we've got those models there to use as, maybe you could say, a litmus test. So anyway, 1192, the second battle of Tarain, Muhammad al-Ghur is now successful. And he captures Delhi. Straight after that, in 1192, Delhi was the capital, and Agra. Delhi and then Agra, which is close by. And Agra was always the treasure house. Any powerhouse in Delhi, they'd keep Agra as their vault, where they'd keep all the treasures and the wealth and the spoils of war. So now we move into the next period of conquest. And this is where Muslims actually set up rule and governance from India itself. That began from the year 1192. Now the Ghurids had slave soldiers, like we said. The slave soldiers actually rose to high ranks and high positions. And to such an extent that when Muhammad al-Ghur died in 1206, he wasn't succeeded by somebody from his own family. He wasn't succeeded by somebody from his own line of children, from his offspring. He was actually succeeded by his own general, a slave general called Qutbuddin Aybak, in the year 1206. And now, this string of rulers, they were unlike their Muslim predecessors because they ushered in a new rule in India, which was, we want to set up a prosperous state, an indigenous native state in India itself. The Ghaznavids, their capital was in Afghanistan. The Umayyads, their capital was in Damascus. They had no intention, they had no ambitions of setting up a stronghold in India. This all changed with the Delhi Sultanate. If you can see it on the board now here, we've got a brief timeline of all 5 of the sub-dynasties. 1206 marks the inauguration of the Delhi Sultanate. There weren't one successive string of rulers. You had different sub-families and sub-dynasties. You had, first of all, the Mamluks. And they were the successors of Qutbuddin Aybak. Why were they called the Mamluks? Mamluk literally means somebody who's owned, somebody who is a possession. And that's the description of a slave. So they were the slave dynasty, the Mamluks. Then you had the Khiljis, you had the Tughlaqs, you had the Sayyids, and then you had the Lodis. And straight after the Lodis, that's when the Mughals come in. So I think to do justice to the Delhi Sultanate and just quickly touch on them, because some amazing things happened during their time, let's just go through a quick, brief chronology timeline of what the Delhi Sultanate actually stood for and what they accomplished, and maybe some of their failures as well. So Qutbuddin Aybak actually died in 1210. Now imagine, this is a military man, this is a commander, this is a general. His heart lies on the battlefield. And he died in a sporting accident whilst playing polo in the year 1210. So he died. And he was then succeeded by his son, Iltutmish. Iltutmish was his son. And Iltutmish, later on, when we talk about, I just want to bring up a brief article from The Guardian, just talk about a few things in there, because it's talking about modern day occurrences, political occurrences in India. And Iltutmish's name actually finds mention in that Guardian article. So he's quite a relevant figure as well. So he expanded considerably. And he actually received the title of Sultanul Hind by the Abbasid Caliph. So the Abbasids recognized the Delhi Sultanate now in India. And he formally made the city Delhi his capital. And now Delhi, this ushers in a new age where Delhi now becomes the cultural, political and spiritual center of the Indian Muslims. And Delhi actually rivaled places like Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and it would later rival places like Istanbul as well. So Delhi would be at the top of the list of the most famous and prosperous and successful Muslim cities. Now, if you want to sum up the Delhi Sultanate with just one contribution, what characterizes the Delhi Sultanate? We can say their greatest service that the Delhi Sultanate rendered not just to Muslims, not just to their own needs and their own political needs, but to India as a whole. I'm talking about Sikhs and Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and Jains, everybody in India. The greatest service they delivered was that they managed to repulse the Mongols. The Mongols, who would consume anything and everything in their path, the Delhi Sultanate, mainly the Mamluks and the Khiljis, managed to repulse and defend India from the Mongols. Now, if they were lax in their guard duties of India, you can only imagine what the Mongols would have done in India. And if you want a glimpse of that, have a look at what they did in Baghdad, have a look at what they did in Bukhara, have a look at what they did in Samarkand, in the Central Asian lands, in Transoxiana, as we call it, Ma wara'un nahr. It's a famous term used in law. Ma wara'un nahr, that which lies beyond the river. Now, what river are we talking about? We're talking about the Amu Darya, the Oxus River, which is in Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan. And it actually acts as a natural partition, a natural buffer between Afghanistan and then the Central Asian lands. Whenever you hear the word Central Asian, just think about the Stan countries. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, which is actually a historical region. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, you get the idea. Kyrgyzstan as well, the Stan countries. And the Mongols decimated that under Genghis Khan. Then his grandson Hulagu Khan destroyed the rest of the Muslim territory in Damascus, in Aleppo, Baghdad as well. If you want an idea what the Mongols would have done in India, open up a history book, everything's there in front of you. And Iltutmish, something which he's always renowned and famed for, is before he died, he actually set his successor. He had sons, but he distrusted his sons. He didn't like his sons. He thought his sons were ineffective, incompetent. So he actually placed on the throne the first Muslim female ruler of India, his daughter, called Razia Sultana. She ruled for 4 years. Now, we don't want to talk about the legitimacy, the legal legitimacy of her rule as a woman. We just want to look at the historical facts. The first Muslim woman ruler of India was Iltutmish's daughter. And she was in charge for 4 years. And to be fair, the rest of the brothers, they despised her because they thought, how can a woman beat us to the throne? So she was eventually deposed, and then his sons came in. And to be fair, the rest of the Mamluk leaders weren't as famous and prosperous as Aybak and Iltutmish. Now, the second and the third dynasties, we're talking about the Khaljis and then the Tughluks, they steadily increased Muslim territory all the way up until Muhammad ibn al-Tughlaq. And to be fair, Muhammad ibn al-Tughlaq is categorized as, by modern historians, and we're talking about state-sponsored historians of India, the ones that distort and doctor history. He's now classified as a bigot, as an anti-Hindu, Hindu-phobe, if you want to call it that. And he's grouped in the same party as Mahmud al-Ghaznawi and then as Aurangzeb as well. And here's an interesting figure. Remember, nothing is ever black and white. There's no such thing as black and white Indian history, Muslims against Hindus. History is just one big grey area. You have to study from every single angle. Now, Muhammad ibn al-Tughlaq, he was an interesting character, to say the least. But to be fair, one of his accomplishments for the Tughluks and for the Tughlaqid state was he managed to bring a lot of the subcontinent under Muslim rule. Now remember, the subcontinent is huge, and the subcontinent has never ever been ruled by one dynasty. There's no one dynasty who has ever ruled 100% all of the Indian subcontinent. Majority of India throughout history was ruled by small tribal confederations and small states with their own autonomy. There was never a central government. The Delhi Sultanate brought about a change in that regard. They started a central governance, and the Mughals then capitalized on that. And under Aurangzeb, actually, 95%. This is the height, this is the peak, the zenith of Muslim and Mughal rule in India. 95% of India was actually consolidated under Muslim rule under Aurangzeb. Except for there were a few states, southern India, the Mysore state, and the Maratha state as well, in southern India. So anyway, that's Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. And to be fair, he's a bit of a polarizing character, because he did some amazing things, and at the same time, he made some detrimental blunders. He was considered as a generous, sorry. Oh, as I thought you had a question. It's okay. As a generous and munificent leader. And to be fair, he had interactions with a Moroccan traveler called Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta, the famous explorer, the famous adventurer. So on his way back from the Arabian Peninsula, he actually encountered Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. We'll talk about his encounter later on. Now the thing is with Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, some historians say he had poor judgment and he had bad policies. I'll just mention a few of them. I don't need to say anything else. You can just gauge it for yourself. He forced his government to move to a new capital he called Dawlat Abad, which is now the capital of the state. They always have these grand titles and names for their new capitals in the south. And remember, the main capital was always Delhi. And to be fair, there's always been a theme, reoccurring theme in history. Whenever people have tried, any government have tried to relocate and move an existing capital, they've always failed miserably. For example, take the Abbasids. Their capital was which city? In Iraq. It was Baghdad, wasn't it? Now, in the later part of the 800s, a caliph came around and he said, I want to relocate the capital to a new place called Samarra, which was at a short distance from Baghdad, because he wanted to house his Mamluk soldiers. His own Mamluk soldiers from Central Asia, they were causing all sorts of problems and havoc in the local towns, because they were obviously uncivilized. So he wanted an entire town for them. Then he thought, I might as well just make this my own capital. And it never worked out. The capital was abandoned, evacuated in 892, and it was just relegated to a market town. So there's always a reoccurring theme like that. So Muhammad ibn Tughlaq wanted to relocate south to Dawlat Abad. And to be fair, it worked out for a little while. It shared power with Delhi for a time. And then out of all things, because of an inadequate water supply, he was forced to relocate back to Delhi. And the city was evacuated and it just lays barren to this day. Some people have said he was merciless to Hindus. And to be fair, you have to be pragmatic. Now, there's one angle, which is you implement the Islamic rules and people just don't like the Islamic laws, so they revolt anyway, and you get people like that. There are plenty of examples of subjects who just don't like Muslim rule, even if it's meted out fairly onto the subjects. Then you get some people who are just outright ruthless and merciless. They were unpragmatic. Muhammad ibn Tughlaq probably stands in between both of these extremes. So because of that, Hindu subjects started to revolt. And that was very taxing on his offices and on his own mental state as well. And he was always overcome by lots of stress and anxiety, thinking about how he can suppress and put down these revolts. And unfortunately for him, and this is always funny, I always see it like this, he tried to expand in India. He tried to expand south, it didn't work. So he averted his gaze and he tried for Central Asia, the Stan countries. That failed as well. So he thought, you know what, let me just try Tibet as well. Southern China. That failed as well. So it was as if he was looking in every single direction and he couldn't see any way out for himself. And at the same time, now, he always had these grand ambitions. Let me take Central Asia, let me take Tibet, let me take some of these Eastern Indian lands. Now for that, you need a huge army. And for an army, you need provisions. And to provide and fund an army, you need money. Like Mahmud Ghaznavi, he needed money to fund his own professional private army. That's why he made his raids and incursions into Western India, the Gujarat and Northern Indian states. So he actually increased taxes, Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, to support his large army. And you can guess what happened after that? The peasants revolted and they rebelled because they don't have the money to fund his massive, lavish military ventures. So that was, again, another negative point to his CV, to his resume. On top of that, this is probably the cream of the crop here, the nail in the coffin for Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. He experimented with coinage. And he decided to replace silver coinage with brass coinage. And obviously, you can tell the difference in value. The intrinsic value of brass is much lower than that of silver. And it went horribly wrong because people started to introduce counterfeit coins and produce their own fake coins. And so his coins lost all value, and he actually had to recall and replace all of his coins, even the forgeries, even the fake ones he had to take back. And that experiment was a complete failure, and then he reverted back to the silver coins. Yes, sorry.
Was that the coin you were referring to? Was that the one that you showed a few weeks ago?
The one we showed was a coin from Mahmud Ghaznavi, which he minted in 1028. in Lahore. But these are different ones. I do have pictures, but I just forgot to add them to the slide. But yeah, you can imagine how disastrous that was for the economy. So now, when Ibn Battuta was passing through Muhammad ibn Tughlaq's lands, in Ibn Battuta's memoirs, he writes that, you know what, Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, he has these downsides, he has these negative points, but he's extremely generous to Muslims. And he favors the Muslims as well, which is always a plus point. And this was manifested in Muhammad ibn Tughlaq giving Ibn Battuta actually a position in the judiciary in Delhi. So he actually made a Maliki judge, a Maliki scholar, the head judge now in Delhi. Now this is always quite funny and laughable and comedic. So Muhammad ibn Tughlaq wanted to have cordial relations with the Chinese. He thought, what better person to send as my envoy and as my diplomat than Ibn Battuta? So he gave Ibn Battuta a whole caravan's load of wealth and treasure and jewels. And he said, I want you to deliver this to the Chinese emperor. Now, Ibn Battuta took all the wealth, took all the gifts, and he began his sea voyage from South Asia, from South India. As he was making his way to China, the ship actually crashed and he was now stranded. So you had a shipwreck scenario here. And when the ship wrecked, then all of the wealth was lost as a result. So Ibn Battuta, he decided to go back to his native Morocco rather than go back to Delhi with his lavish post and all of his stipends and wages he was getting from Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, because he thought, if I go back, he's going to kill me. He's going to have my head because I've completely blown a trade and diplomatic mission like this. So he went back to Morocco. So that was Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. Now the problem is his lands started to fragment into these regional kingdoms. Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, everything was under his control, at least for a short while. Then things started to fragment and splinter, and you had all of these different lands just before his death. Then the nail in the coffin for the Tughluqids. They were only in charge for around, maybe, as you can see there, for less than 30 years. The nail in their coffin was the advances of the Mongols. So the Chagatai Mongols, who now control the Central Asian lands, saw nowhere else for them to go. They had reached maximum growth. They couldn't go anywhere else because wherever they looked, there were fellow Mongol territories, fellow Mongol khanates, as they were called. So they started to look south into northern India. And they made raid after raid after raid, which really weakened the Tughluqids. But to their credit, the Tughluqids managed to respond and repulse each Mongol attack. The main one being in 1299. That was the main one. And that's what the Tughluqids will always be remembered for. The Khaljis and the Tughluqids as well. Okay, so now for the Tughluqids, actually, this was the main nail in the coffin here, was 1398. Yeah, so the Tughluqids, sorry, I got mixed up between the Khaljis. So the Tughluqids we're talking about here. In 1398, somebody invaded Delhi and completely destroyed it.
The more learning his name was, and he was actually from Persia and Iran, and one of his legs was shorter than the other.
MashaAllah, I think you should come and take my place here, MashaAllah. Yeah, so he's always one step ahead. Timur, he was he claimed to be a descendant of the great Mongol Genghis Khan, but what we can actually say is he wasn't. In fact, he was simply he was part of a tribe which were the cousins of the Mongols, so distant relatives, but he didn't actually hail from the lineage of Genghis Khan. And Timur, I mean, we can have a whole lecture on him, but just to sum up Timur, his name was, one of his nicknames was the Prince of Destruction. Even though he was a Muslim, he was a nominal Muslim, his whole political slogan was, we need to relive the glory days of the Mongol Empire. By 1398, by the late 1300s, the Mongols had lost all of their authority and lost most of their power because a lot of them had actually converted to Islam. And like we said, they reached maximum growth. They couldn't expand anywhere else. And they slowly started to fall apart because the Mongols weren't politicians. They weren't bureaucrats. They couldn't run and keep a state together. So that's why they crumbled. Quite as amazing as the Mongol rise was, their decline was also as spectacular and as rapid and as swift. So Timur wanted to then bring glory back to the Mongols. And he started his conquest and his campaign. Any city that came in his path was completely decimated. It was wiped off the face of this earth. Completely destroyed. He would massacre the entire population and he would take back with him the artisans and the scholars and the intellectuals and the engineers, ship them back to his capital in Samarkand, and he'd have them build all of these magnificent monuments and architectural structures and edifices, which made Samarkand the Dubai of its time, if you want to call it that. He set his sights on India, and he came in 1398. He was almost 60 years old, but the wealth of India was just too attractive. He just couldn't let it go. So the wealthy capital of India was next on his target, and he then plundered and siphoned all of the wealth. He took everything that was in Delhi, and people thought that's the end. People thought that's the end of the Delhi Sultanate, that's the end of Muslim rule in India. How can anybody recover from such a, you could say, they were a neo-Mongol invasion, new Mongols, even though they weren't actually Mongols, like our young brother said here. They were actually a mixture of Mongols and Turks who'd then become Persianized. So they'd come into contact with the Persians in Central Asia, and to be fair, most of the states in Central Asia had become Persianized. The Persian language was now the main official language. All the records and registers were kept in Persian. People were influenced by Persian culture because it was the culture of the higher class and the upper class and the bourgeois, if you want to call it that, the ruling elite. And some historians narrow down and pinpoint Timur's expedition and his campaign to a lack of ruthlessness to Hindus. Apparently, Timur was saying, the Tughlaqs aren't ruthless enough. They aren't brutal enough to the Hindus. As Muslims, you have to be hard and stamp down your authority on these polytheists. So that's why he thought, let me go in and do the job myself. But what we can actually say is it's never as black and white and as simple as that. He was lured in by the wealth of Delhi. And he crossed the Indus River, and he began his bloody march to Delhi. And he actually met Muhammad ibn al-Tughlaq near the Yamuna River, which is close to Delhi, just outside of Delhi. And there wasn't any doubt that he'd completely destroy the forces and rout the forces of Muhammad ibn al-Tughlaq, and now Delhi was fair game. And just to give you an idea, like we said, the Khaljis, how they managed to repulse all of the Mongols. Now imagine if the Mongols got their hands on India, if they made their way into India. Yeah? Just to give you a glimpse of what Timur did. Timur had 50,000. Whilst he was besieging Muhammad ibn Tughlaq and his forces in Delhi, he had 50,000 Indian, Muslim and Hindu prisoners with him that he'd accumulated over his march to Delhi. And Ibn Tughlaq was quite daring in one of his strategic moves. So he sent out a swift cavalry battalion, and they carried out a few quick raids on the Timur army, the Timurid army, and actually caused a few casualties. And then they retreated and secured themselves back in their forts in Delhi. Now Timur wasn't happy with this because it was a quick raid and he didn't have enough time to respond. At the same time, the prisoners in his camp, the Indian prisoners, were getting riled up now. That raid had galvanized them, so they were starting to become a bit bold. So he thought there might be an insurrection within my own prisoner camp. So do you know what he did? He completely axed off the entire prisoner camp. 50,000 people just killed off like that to prevent a revolt. Now imagine what he would have done if he came into control of the entire territory of India. And even when Delhi was completely cleared of Tughlaq's army, Muhammad ibn Tughlaq's army, Timur didn't want to sack it at that time. He sent in a few of his soldiers, and to be fair, the Delhi Sultanate had managed to construct magnificent pieces of architecture and buildings and these imposing structures in Delhi that it became a tourist attraction. So even the people that accompanied the Timurid diplomats and governors, they wanted to tour the city. So Timur sent some of his cavalrymen to escort them as a guard, and they can marvel at the city sights. Now the guards, soldiers sometimes are undisciplined. So the Timurid soldiers who were sent only as guards, they ended up then, when they saw the wealth that just the average citizen of Delhi had, it was just too attractive and it was just too enticing, so they fell to their desires, they succumbed to their desires, and they started to loot people's houses one by one. Now Timur, he had no control over his troops, and now imagine, you've got a few of his troops moving inside of Delhi, taking what they want, and now you've got his agitated troops outside who are raring to go into Delhi and loot and plunder and pillage for themselves. He couldn't hold his troops back, so he just gave them a blank check and said, right, you can all make your way in. And that's when the looting and pillaging and siphoning of wealth from Delhi began. And they took everything with them. That was Timur. He actually crowned himself the Emperor of Hindustan. And the amount of wealth that was in Delhi, unimaginable. 90 elephants loaded with wealth were taken back to Timur's capital. just from that one city in Delhi. As he left, he appointed one of his governors, Khizr Khan, as the main governmental official now in Delhi. This is where we now move into the Sayyids. Yep. So the Sayyids, their first ruler was Khizr Khan. Like we said, he was appointed by the Timurids. And he claimed to be a Sayyid, meaning a descendant of the Prophet ﷺ. And remember, if you as a Muslim claim to be a descendant of the Prophet, that's all the political clout and backing you need. People will come flocking to you automatically. Now today, if someone wants to follow, what do they say? I'm the Mahdi, and that's it. They've already got a crowd formed. Even if they don't even fit the bill, fit the criteria, they already have a crowd forming and a following already at their behest. So Khizr Khan claimed to be a Sayyid. Now, he still ruled Delhi, or whatever was left of the Delhi Sultanate, as a vassal, meaning as a subordinate of Timur's state in Samarkand. So he was a tributary now. And the harsh reality was the Muslims had now been split. The regional kingdoms now had been formed, and every Muslim is for himself. The once centralized system that Muhammad ibn Tughlaq envisioned was now crumbling away. And it now became an escaping reality. It was moving out to the grips of the Muslims. You had the Gujarat state that was ruled by one Muslim, the Malwa state, the Jaunpur state, the Bengal state, the Bahmani state, the Bahmani Sultanate in Deccan. Deccan is the middle region, the southern central regions of India. The Sayyids, to be honest, quite uneventful. Not much happened. The thing that changed the course of Sayyids' history in the Delhi Sultanate was they started to enlist Afghan soldiers and Afghan officers into their army. And in 1448, these soldiers actually staged a coup and revolt against their own masters. These were Afghan tribesmen. And they then appointed one of their own clansmen called Bahlul Lodi. And this is where we now move into the last phase of the Delhi Sultanate, the Lodi state. Why? Because the family name was Lodis and they were from Afghanistan. If you can see here, there's another reoccurring pattern. Majority, or you can actually say all of the Muslim expeditions and conquests into India happened from Afghanistan. Majority of them. The Khyber Pass, as it's called, K-H-Y-B-E-R, or the Khyber Pass, as its anglicized pronunciation is. The Khyber Pass is a mountainous pass region which connects the Afghanistan lands with the Indian lands. And majority of the Muslim armies have made their way from there. Muhammad of Sur was one of them, the Ghaznavids being another, Sabuktajin, the Afghans as well. And to be fair, it's quite cruel to the Afghans to say that, and to be fair, people today only really know the Afghans for the Taliban. But Afghanistan history is a lot more rich and comprehensive than that. And it spans all the way back to the Delhi Sultanate reign. Even with the Ghaznavids, like we said, their power base was in Afghanistan. So there's a lot to appreciate with Afghanistan. Now they've got Bahlul Lodi. And the Lodi state is quite easy to remember. They only had 3 rulers. Bahlul Lodi was the number 1. Number 2 was his son, who was Sikandar. And number 3 was his son, Ibrahim Lodi. And now he's in charge. And to the credit of the Delhi Sultanate, they managed to regain much lost dominance and domination of the Delhi Sultanate. So they actually managed to put the Delhi Sultanate back on the map. When people thought that the Delhi Sultanate were now 6 feet under in their graves, there was no chance of a resurrection and a revival of the great Delhi Sultanate, the Lodis managed to prove that claim wrong. And they started to unite all of these separate states. And they started to increase their power base. Bahlul Lodi, especially with his son. His son, Sikandar Lodi, now established. And the reason why we have to go into this is because important developments happen during these reigns, which then help us to appreciate what happened during the Mughal rule. For example, his son, Bahlul Lodi's son, Sikandar Lodi, established his new capital of Agra in the year 1505. Before that, it was just you could say, a garrison town. And it was just a small cluster of buildings where the previous sultans would hold their wealth. Now he built it up into a fully fledged palatial capital with palace complexes and grandiose buildings and all of these imposing structures. 1505. Now why is that important? Because Agra is a central location when it comes to Mughal history. And if anybody's been to Delhi, you can't go to Delhi without visiting Agra. A lot of the Mughal monuments are actually housed in Agra, the main one being Taj Mahal itself. So the Lodi is actually remembered for patronizing and for actually supporting culture and the development of religiosity. And to their credit, they gave the Delhi Sultanate a level of stability which they hadn't had in decades. So this was a welcome development. And this is when the ties between the local scholars and the Sufis started to strengthen with the political leaders. And then we had Sikandar's son Ibrahim Lodi, who people say actually reversed the developments and the successes of his predecessors. And then Ibrahim Lodi, we get to the first battle of Panipat. Before we get there, you might not remember everything we've discussed about the Delhi Sultanate, but a few things you should remember. We'll just condense it here into a few political trends. Number one is that the Sultanate was based on a Turkic slave dynasty, like we said. And in Turkic slave dynasties, not just Turkic, but all slave dynasties, power was never passed through hereditary succession, from father to son, then to his son, then to his son. They had another succession policy, which was actually more pragmatic and actually worked better. It was more effective, which was the generals, the slave generals, would elect a notable to be the next leader, to be the next sultan. And sultans were actually, and occasionally, they were recalled and then they were deposed if they weren't fulfilling their duties. If they weren't effective enough, then you're not fit enough for the job and you'll be ousted and the next one will be called in. This is the policy, the overwhelming policy of the Delhi Sultanate. Again, they didn't claim caliphate, and that's something that you have to understand. They still saw themselves as subordinates, subjects of the Abbasid Caliphate. They ultimately recognized authority as being in the hands of the Abbasids in Baghdad. Even afterwards, now remember, Baghdad fell in 1258. So people thought that's the end of the Caliphate. Now in 1261, just after 1262 actually, the Mamluks in Egypt had defeated the Mongols at a decisive battle known as the Battle of Ain Jalut in modern-day Levant, in the Fertile Crescent, in Syria and Palestine. And now the new leader was called Zahiruddin Baybaras. That was his name, the victor. He's known as Al-Malik al-Zahir, the king, the victor, Baybaras. Now he's a slave. And the slave dynasty actually wrestled power from the Ayyubids. Just like Qutbuddin Aybak took power from his masters, the Ghurids, the Mamluks in Egypt actually wrestled power from their masters, the Ayyubids, the dynasty set up by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And the problem now is you have slaves in charge. And the Egyptian population, the citizens of the Ayyubid state, won't accept slaves as leaders because they weren't worthy of political legitimacy. So Zahiruddin Baybaras had to think of a strategy wherein he could be the leader and at the same time he could placate and he could calm down the masses and then lure them into accepting his rule. Now remember, this is 4 years after the Abbasid Caliphate was completely destroyed in Baghdad. A few members of the Abbasid Caliphate actually survived the massacre in Baghdad. So Zahiruddin Baybaras saw an opportunity for himself. He actually imported one of the descendants of the Abbasid caliphs and set him up as the caliph in Mamluk-controlled Egypt, in Cairo. So now, Zahiruddin Baybaras was saying, look, we've instated a caliph here, we have a caliphate. The caliphate was known as the shadow Abbasid Caliphate. Why they call the shadow? Because they worked in the shadows. Because Zahiruddin Baybaras, he wasn't genuinely then worried and concerned about resurrecting the caliphate. It was for his own needs. How can I have my own political legitimacy? So he thought to himself, if I have a caliph and say, the caliph is actually the main ruler, I'm just a subject of the caliph, I'm just an employee of the caliph, then I can be the sultan of the Ayyubid lands and the caliph can just be a puppet figurehead. So the Mamluks were actually pulling the strings. The only thing the Abbasid caliph in Cairo had to do was just give the go-ahead and rubber stamp the next sultan. That's the only thing he could do. Apart from that, his power was zero. He was just a titular figurehead. That's it. So this is 1262. And after that, remember, 1262, we've still got the rule of the Mamluks and then the Khiljis and the Tughluks. So the later part of the Delhi Sultanate interacted with the Abbasids in Mamluk-controlled Egypt. And they still recognize the Mamluks, the Abbasids in Egypt, even though nobody else. I mean, nobody else acknowledged and even respected the Abbasid Caliph in Cairo. They didn't see them as anything, except for the Delhi Sultanate. They still respected the Caliph there in Cairo. And the sultans would actually send emissaries. They'd send their own diplomats to the Caliph in Cairo, seeking their approval and seeking permission to exercise power. Can we then exercise our power in your name as the subordinates of the Caliphate? And this was actually commendable of the Delhi Sultanate. Why? Because they wanted to keep India connected with the greater and the wider Muslim world. They didn't want India to be isolated. They wanted India to still be part of the global Islamic movement, which was commendable from their part. Despite the separation of thousands of miles, you've got the Himalayan mountains and then the Hindu Kush mountain range. It was difficult, but they still made it their mission to remain, then you could say, relevant with the rest of the Muslim world. And like we said, final point, they were the first real Muslim power to dig their heels into Indian soil. And interestingly, they actually supported and backed missionary efforts from Sufi scholars as a political entity. They backed and gave their funding and approval and permission to Sufis to carry out their missionary work and proselytization and bringing people closer to Islam across India. And that's how actually most Indians came into contact with Islam, through either traders or through Sufis. And even before anybody, any military presence set foot in India, traders from the Arabian Peninsula, most notably Yemen, had actually come into contact with the western coast of India. And they actually exposed the native Hindus and Buddhists and Jain people there to Islam. So they were the ones that actually laid the ground. And now you had, coming into the Delhi Sultanate, you had these itinerant, meaning constantly moving, on the move, Arabian and Persian Sufis, who had their state sponsorship, and they were traveling across India, spreading their message, and they were preaching spiritual fulfillment and a newfound connection with God. Now, when I came across these points in academic histories, and even Muslim histories mention the same as well, they say that Sufism thrived in India because it focused on the spiritual aspect of Islam, which managed to bring the Hindus, who are always very spiritual people, closer to Islam. And this point is actually used to then deride and actually revile Islam. Some Western academics use this to say that Islam as a true monotheistic religion wasn't powerful and convincing enough to bring these polytheists to Islam. So that's why the Sufis had to step in and carry out the job for them. And the Sufis were always quite wishy-washy, and they were quite liberal. They allowed all sorts of practices to creep into Islam, and they allowed the old previous rituals and cultural traditions to be then transferred into Islam from their previous religions, especially Hinduism. But I think that's an unfair assessment. And to be fair, it's probably in the middle. We can say that the Sufis were then very convincing in their approach, but it wasn't as if Islam wasn't able to convert them. It was just that one aspect of Islam, which is focusing on the spiritual element, worked in favor of these Sufis. Just like if you have somebody who's inclined to philosophy, then you can possibly use philosophy to bring them to Islam. If you have somebody who is into science, you can use science and the scientific, possibly miracles in the Quran, to bring them closer to Islam. So that's why Islam is multifaceted. There are lots of different angles you can examine Islam from. And people will accept Islam and convert due to different reasons. So that's why if you utilize this multi-dimensional structure of Islam, then you'll have people who will then resonate with different elements. And the Hindu people, they resonated with the spiritual, the heightened spiritual elements of the Sufis. So that's why they were prosperous and they thrived when it came to converting people. And people have heard the stories. For example, Mu'inuddin Chishti, he would go back to his mum and he would, I wouldn't say brag, but he'd relate the news to his mum that some 9 million people have accepted Islam at his hands, or he's managed to convert so many people in such a gathering. And there were actually incidents where Sufi preachers in an entire gathering, an entire audience would stand up in one go and profess their adherence to Islam. So Sufis were very successful in Islam. And as a precursor to that, you had the Indian Ocean trade to coastal regions like Gujarat, which is in the west. And here you have different religious dynamics. And if you actually think about this, it's quite interesting to note. The main Arab traders that came to India were from Yemen. And Yemen at that time was the trading hub and also the learning hub of the Arabian Peninsula. And the Shafi'i school of thought dominated there. So when these Yemeni traders moved to the western coast of India, they brought with them their Yemeni tradition of Sufism as well as the Yemeni school of thought, which was the Shafi'i fiqh. So the Eastern African regions, the coastal Indian regions, and Southeast Asia became dominated by Shafi'i fiqh. Why? Because they came into contact with Yemeni traders. Whereas in the northern states, a lot of them became Hanafi. Why? Because they came into contact with the encroaching Turkic forces that came from the Central Asian lands. And they were dominated and they were ruled by the Hanafi school of law. So it's interesting to note these religious dynamics which affected India. Okay, now finally, we can quickly move on to the Mughals. So that's the Delhi Sultanate finished now. We've talked about the Ghurids and then the Delhi Sultanate. Now we can move on to the Mughals. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, and that it might be a little bit mind-boggling to try and decipher that map, but if you can see all of the green and then the turquoise regions in the middle, they were under the control of the Delhi Sultanate, except for the Bahmanid Sultanate in the middle here. Yeah, so that's the entirety of India, and if I can just point it out here, India is huge. It's massive. The Delhi Sultanate exercised power only up until here. That's less than 50%. The rest of it here were just made up of independent autonomous confederations, either Hindu or Muslim. For example, the Bahmanids here, they were Muslims. The Gujarat state over here, they were half Muslim and half Hindu as well. So now, when I tell you that Aurangzeb managed to consolidate 95% of this under his reign, then you can understand the magnitude of his success. 95%, except for the Mysore state and the Maratha state just here. Southeast India over there. So you can appreciate how India has always been challenging for any ruler, because you've got so many different people, such a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual setup. It's difficult to bring everything under one control. And it's difficult to then have people accept you as the central authority. But inshallah, we'll get to that when we talk about Aurangzeb. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay. You can just marvel at that for a second. You've got that's the genealogy, the lineage of the Mughal rulers. And we're going to start right over there with Babar. Now, you can see something top left. Whose name is there top left? You've got Timur. Yeah, so Timur is actually the great-great-great-grandfather of Babar. That's why the Mughals themselves never actually referred to themselves as Mughals. That was only a British designation. In the early 1800s, that's when the British, when they were distorting history, writing, when the East India Company, when their official state company-sponsored historians were distorting history, they referred to the previous rulers, or the current rulers at that time, 1800s, as the Mughals. Now, where did Mughal come from? What's the etymology? What's the origins? Mughal is a Persian word, which simply means a Mongol. As simple as that. Mughal is a Persian word meaning Mongol. Why? Because the Mughal rulers hailed from the Mongol tradition of Timur. Even though we can say Timur was half Turkic and half Mongol. Mongols and Turks are different. They're distant cousins. Maybe you could say like the Arabs and the Jews. The Arabs and the Israelites, how they were cousins. The Mongols and the Turks were cousins like that. So Timur's ancestors had actually then joined forces and made an alliance with Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan, he was famous for uniting all of these scattered and dispersed tribes in Mongolia and turning them into a great formidable empire, the empire of the great Khan, as he called it. And he was the first. Khan just means a leader, a king in Turkic Mongol. So he was the first great Khan, the first great leader. So you can see here how everything again links in with each other. Nothing is ever disconnected, nothing is ever detached. So the Mughals hailed from Timur. And in India, anybody who came from Central Asia was known as a Mughal. Anybody who came from those lands was known as a Mongol. Even though, like we said, historically speaking, that's not completely correct. Because Mongols and Turks were different. Timur was, you could say, half Turkic, half Mongol as well. So that's an interesting point to bear in mind. And Timur, he keeps on re-emerging as a model of political rule and of architecture and of culture. Timur, he influenced nearly every single one of these greater Mughals. And I think I should make this distinction now. You had two distinct periods of Mughal rule. The greater Mughal period, which encompassed the first six, from Babar, you can see that, all the way to Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb, who's the bottom here. So that's the list of actually the greater Mughals. After Aurangzeb died, you had the lesser Mughals for obvious reasons, because they weren't as effective as the first six. So just to give you an idea as to how powerful and how awe-inspiring the Mughals actually were, if you look up the word Mughal in the English dictionary today, you'll find that it has links with the actual Mughals in India. And a Mughal, M-O-G-U-L, is somebody who's an expert in the fashion industry or the movie industry. Somebody who's an expert, somebody who knows his way around everything. A master. Because the Mughals were the masters of India. The Mughals, their main accomplishment, if anything, was to put India on the map. Under Aurangzeb, and even before him, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, 24% of the entire globe's GDP was concentrated to India. Under Aurangzeb, they actually managed to surpass the Qing dynasty in China as the world's leading economy. 24% of the wealth of the world was restricted to India. That's what they managed to do. They managed to put India on the map. And to be fair, when people say that the British in India, they were colonists from day one, that's actually not completely correct. That's not historically correct. Because what is colonialism? Colonialism is the ideology of making another group of people who are so-called uncivilized, less sophisticated than you, enlightening them. That's why colonialism is dubbed as the white man's mission. Mission to civilize people and enlighten people with Western ideals and the Western way of living. When the British actually came to India as the East India Trading Company, they used to beg at the feet of Mughal rulers. They saw the Mughal rulers as gods that were untouchable. The British in India would actually adopt the customs and the tradition and the culture of Indian Mughals. That's why there's a book written by William Dalrymple called The White Mughal. And he talks about how when the British actually came into India, they were so fascinated and taken aback by Mughal splendor and Mughal wealth and their attire and their fashion and everything to do with life in India, that they, the British, wanted to be like the Mughals. It was only at the start of the 1800s, when Mughal power dwindled, that the British Englishmen became racist, where they saw the Indians as inferior to them. But for the last 200 years, they saw the Mughals as superior, as the superior civilization, because the Mughals had everything. So, contrary to what you hear today, the Hindus saying that the Mughals are the ones that destroyed India. They took India off the map. In actual fact, the Mughals put India on the map. Economically, culturally, and even from a civilization point of view. So it's very important that we appreciate that before we even move into India and the Mughals. They were the last Muslim dynasty, the last dynasty of Central Asian Muslims to rule India. And they ruled for 300 years. This is where things get interesting now. From the 1500s all the way till 1924, when the Ottoman Caliphate was abolished, that period of history is known as the era of the gunpowder empires. The era of the gunpowder empires. And they consisted of three Muslim dynasties, super dynasties, juggernaut dynasties. The Ottomans, based in modern-day Turkey, the Safavids, Shia, based in modern-day Iran, and the Mughals in modern-day Delhi in India. Why were they known as the gunpowder empires? Because they were the first to employ gunpowder, as the name suggests. Now, it does what it says on the tin. They were the first to employ gunpowder in the form of muskets, early form of firearms, and cannons on the battlefield. And to be fair, this is really interesting. The origins of the Mughal state in India is like one big family you could say, political mess. One big family domestic situation between the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals. All three of them had a hand to play in the creation of the Mughal state in India. We'll get to it, don't worry. Okay, now just very quickly. The Mughals, they actually never referred to themselves as sultans. They used to refer to themselves as Padishah, which is Persian, a Middle Persian or a Pahlavi term. Pahlavi was an earlier manifestation of Persian, and it's actually a superlative Persian title, and it evolved into the Urdu Badshah. So Padishah and Badshah. So they refer to themselves as Badshahs. The Safavids, the Shia in Iran, referred to themselves as Shahs, and the Ottomans referred to themselves as, earlier on, as Beys. A Bey is just a tribal leader. And if people watch Ertugrul, then you'll know Ertugrul Bey and Osman Bey, as they call themselves. And then later on they evolved. It's disputed, but it was either Osman, the founder of the Ottoman state, it was either his son, Orhan, or his grandson, Murad, who first termed themselves as sultans. And you know what's actually interesting about all of these three gunpowder nations? All of them have origins in Central Asia. They are all of Central Asian origin. The Ottomans came from the Seljuks, from Central Asia. The Mughals came from Timur, from Central Asia. The Safavids came from Central Asia, even though they tried to push for what's called the Persian Renaissance. They wanted to relive the glory days of the Persian Sassanid Empire. And it's always baffling because they weren't Persians. They were Turks in the garb of Persians. They saw the political slogan and motto of a resurrection of Persian culture as the perfect political move, as the best way to garner support of the masses, of the Persian masses, who'd never actually seen, since the days of the Sassanids, during the time of the Prophet and the time of the rightly guided caliphs, the Persians never had their own state. So when the Safavid Shahs came along, and Shah is actually a Persian title, and they gave themselves the title Shah, then they managed to rally people around their cause, even though it was a ruse simply to prop up Shia Islam and give Shia Islam a stage on the political world theatre. Okay, very quickly, if we can talk about Babar today and how the state was initiated, and then we can move on to the next ones maybe next week and talk about Aurangzeb. So very quickly, the first founder of the Mughal state was Babar. Babar wasn't actually his name. Babar means tiger. Can we just go to the next one? I'm not sure if there was anything on that. And the next one. Okay, here we've got Babar here. And just these are the main events which took place. He was born in 1483. I'll expound on all of these. He inherits Farghana in just after his birth. 1504 he rules from Kabul, which is in Afghanistan. 1514 he's defeated by the Uzbeks, and 1526 first battle of Panipat. 1530 his death. So he was born as Zahiruddin. Zahiruddin was his name, which just means the supporter of the religion. His title Babar actually means tiger, and a lot of these Mughal emperors had what we call regal titles, titles given to kings and sovereigns. Babar, for example, even you had Akbar, Shah Jahan, Jahangir, Aurangzeb. These are all regal titles. They weren't their actual names. So some have actually classed Babar as the founder of the Mughal dynasty. In actual fact, the Mughal dynasty was founded, technically speaking, by his grandson Akbar, nearly 30 years after the first battle of Panipat in around 1556. So Babar is termed as maybe a precursor or a forerunner or the progenitor, somebody who came just before, rather than the actual state builder and the state founder. And that's important because there's a difference here. Yeah, and you'll realize why Babar and his son Humayun actually weren't classed as, technically, historically speaking, as the founders of the Mughal state, because their power was actually genuinely consolidated under Akbar. He was the one who then let the state flourish into an empire in India. Babar, yes.
That was one Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, wasn't it?
Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, there's just bear that name in mind, because the scholars of his time actually distorted and corrupted that title to call him something else because of his anti-Islam rhetoric. Remember, Jalaluddin Akbar, they actually changed it to something else. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but we'll get to it when we get to Akbar. So Babar was a 5th generation descendant of Timuri Lang, translated as Tamerlane. Timur means iron in Turkic, and Lang means lame because, like our young brother said, he had a limp. And he was a fascinating character. He was a Muslim by name, maybe by nominal practice. In terms of his religious ethics, his war ethics, and his overall outlook, his worldview, he was Mongol. He saw himself as the successor of Genghis Khan because none of Genghis Khan's own children, maybe except for Hulagu Khan, were able to live up to his title and to his name. And truly, as a Mongol descendant, he wanted to relive that. To be fair, he did. He nearly finished off the Ottomans. He nearly destroyed the Ottoman state when they hadn't even lifted up from the ground in 1402. Ottoman state had only been around for nearly 100 years, and he delivered a decisive blow. He nearly decapitated the state. It was just the head of the state was hanging on by a thread. It was a miracle that they actually managed to recuperate from that loss, the Ottomans. For 10 years, they were embroiled in a civil war called the Ottoman Interregnum. He defeated the Bayezid, the Sultan Bayezid the first, at the Battle of Ankara, which is just outside of modern-day Ankara. So he was ruthless. He was ruthless. But he was the great-great-great-grandfather of Babar. That's why, like we said, backtracking, the Mughals didn't refer to themselves as Mughals, they referred to themselves as Timurids. We're Timurids, we're Timuris, not the Mughals. Yep. So that's why in most historical books you actually find the Mughals titled as the Timurid Empire of India, even though Timur had his own empire as well. And Babar's mother was an actual genuine descendant of Genghis Khan. So he is now a combination of these two great Mongol Turkic traditions. Genghis Khan from his mum's side and then Timur from his father's side. And he was a warrior. The warrior nature was in his blood. He was born in Andijan, in modern-day Uzbekistan, in 1483. And being a Turk, he spoke Chagatai Turkish. Chagatai is the name of one of Genghis Khan's sons. And from Chagatai, you had one of the 4 breakaway Khanates, after Genghis passed away, called the Chagatai Khanate. And they had their own evolved and updated form of Mongol Turkic. So that's what Babar spoke. Remember, this is the first ruler of India, Mughal ruler of India. He doesn't even speak the native language. He speaks Chagatai Turkish. He was also fluent in Persian. Why was that? Because Persian was the language of choice of the nobility in Central Asia. Now, Timur had amassed a vast empire. Timur's empire, unfortunately, after his death, was reduced to just small lands based around Turkestan and Uzbekistan. Remember, Samarkand is his capital, which is in Uzbekistan. All of the surrounding regions had been taken by these new up-and-coming rising up states in Uzbekistan, just known as the Uzbek Khanate. So they were his now arch enemies, the Uzbek Khanates, and they were encroaching on his land. And obviously, as he is a descendant of Timur, he now inherits the Farghana Valley. The Farghana Valley, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. And it was a strategic military post for the Timurids. So Babar, being a descendant, that's now under his control. Unfortunately, he couldn't hang on to it for too long because of these encroaching Uzbeks. And he was kicked out of his own land, of Uzbekistan. Seeking refuge, nowhere to go, he made his way to Kabul in, again, modern-day Afghanistan. Afghanistan just keeps reappearing here. Afghanistan is a hotspot. It's always been a flashpoint for activity, even today. And he found his new power base in Kabul, in Afghanistan, like we said, in the year 1504. And he amasses followers, officers in his army, and politicians behind him. His goal now is still not India. His goal is, I've got my own army, I'm looking back to Uzbekistan. How can I recapture territory from these Uzbek Khanates? And he tried, and he tried, and he tried. And in the year just before 1514, he actually managed to, after hard struggle and toil, to regain his beloved city, his homeland of Uzbekistan. And that was actually with the help of a Safavid Shah, the founder of the Safavid Empire, Shah Ismail. Just before 1514, which is an important date. Just to sidetrack, when he actually went to Kabul, he actually fell in love with the city of Kabul. Babar had written a book, his own memoir, his own diary called the Babar Nama. And in there he wrote about how he was madly in love with Kabul, with the climate, with the culture, with the flora, meaning the flower setup there, with nature. He just loved Kabul to bits. He was so in love with the city. But he still had his eyes on the states in Uzbekistan, Samarkand eventually. So with the help of Shah Ismail, they teamed up. There was an alliance between him and Babar. He managed to retake some parts of Uzbekistan. And in the year 1514, he ended up losing control. He only had control. It was like Uzbekistan for Babar was like a burning piece of coal. He could only hold on to it for a few moments and then it was gone, out of his reach again. Taken back by the Uzbeks, the Uzbekistan Khanate. In the same year, something then revolutionary happened in Shaldiran, which is in modern day Iran. Shaldiran in 1514. That was when the then Ottoman Sultan Salim Yavuz, Salim the Grim, Salim I, he defeated the Safavid Shah Ismail in a decisive battle that completely routed the Safavid forces. And you know what the funny thing was? The Safavids only initiated their state in the late 1490s. They'd only been operative for no less than 2 decades, and now they were on the brink of extinction. But then again, like the Ottomans, when they were defeated by Timur, they somehow managed to climb out of the ditch and then really give that rebirth and renaissance to Persian culture. And they managed to build themselves up from the bottom, build them up again. And that was in the same year that Babar was kicked out of Uzbekistan. He goes back to Kabul, retreats. He has nowhere to go, no hope of Samarkand. As a last resort, his attention diverts to India. His attention diverts to Delhi now. And he later on used to say, Babar would write in his Babar Nama, the best thing to ever happen to me, it was a blessing in disguise that I was defeated by the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, the Uzbek Khanate. Because if I had won, then I would never have come into contact with India. Now, who were the Indian rulers at this time? 1514 we're talking about. Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, the Lodi dynasty. And Ibrahim Lodi was having a bit of a tough time in India at the moment. Again, he was originally from Afghanistan. He was detested by his Indian subjects, and even his own Afghan officials and countrymen despised him. Now, one of his governors in Punjab, called Daulat Khan Lodi, he resented Ibrahim Lodi for one main reason. Ibrahim Lodi was trying to centralize the government. He was trying to wrestle power away from individual power, independent power, away from these governors and officials and rein it in back to the central government, which any government official is not going to like, because that means he has less power, less authority. Now at the same time, he'd heard of Babar making his capital, making his residency in Kabul. He put one and one together and he thought to himself, I can utilize Babar to depose Ibrahim Lodi, and at the same time I can have my own political interest fulfilled, which is stop the centralization of the Delhi Sultanate. So he called on Babar for military help in overthrowing Ibrahim Lodi. This is now when we move on to the first battle of Panipat. Panipat is, again, it's another one of those flashpoints in history, because Panipat had one battle. 30 years later, had a second battle. And in the 1750s, had a third battle. And all 3 battles were decisive in shaping the landscape of India. All of these 3 battles then structured and molded how India would effectively be governed and how India would be recognized and ruled in the coming centuries even. So Panipat is a very important place, and for the scholars, Panipat would ring some bells because of Qadi Thanallah Panipati with his tafsir Mazhari. And so he hailed from Panipat, which is just a small town, Panipat. But it was very important when it came to the Mughals. Babar was severely outnumbered and outmanned. Babar had 12,000 to 25,000 troops, varying on reports. So 12,000, 25,000. Ibrahim Lodi had how many? 100,000 soldiers at his disposal. The battle took place 1526, the first Battle of Panipat, and Panipat is located around 80 kilometers north of Delhi. Even though he was outnumbered, numerically, he had a trick up his sleeve. And this is where all three of these gunpowder nations inadvertently, accidentally, all combined to create the Mughal state. When Salim I destroyed, completely decimated Shah Ismail's forces in Shaldiran, he used cannons. Yeah, he used cannons. And no, imagine, you've never seen cannons before. Suddenly, artillery appears out of nowhere and your forces have no match whatsoever. Nobody can match. You can't match artillery, cannons with archers. It's just unfathomable. So when Shah Ismail was defeated, imagine, for the next few days, the only thing he was seeing in his head was cannons, cannons, cannons. He was having dreams about gunpowder. He's having dreams about artillery, dreams about ordnance. And remember, at that time, 1514, who was he allied with? Babar. He was an ally of Babar, helping him regain Uzbekistan. So Shah Ismail said, I've discovered gunpowder, thanks to the Ottomans. And he shared this secret with Babar. 1514, 1526 Panipat. Over 10 years, Babar managed to modernize his army by employing cannons, by employing gunpowder. Now the trick up his sleeve was the curtain was unveiled, and Ibrahim Lodi, who had probably sat there with a smug look on his face, thinking 100,000 soldiers against 15,000, it's not even a contest. How can this even be a match? When Babar unveiled his wagon fortresses, then you can just imagine Ibrahim Lodi's heart just moving up into his throat when he saw cannons, probably for the first time. This was the first time gunpowder, and obviously as a corollary, cannons and artillery was used in India. The first time. So we've got record-breaking events taking place here, groundbreaking occurrences. And he actually used wagon fortresses, again, which was an initiative of his time, and it was an innovation, creative innovation. A wagon fortress is just a wooden wagon which has then shields as a defense, and there are small peepholes where cannons can then do their damage from. So they were positioned in a crescent formation at the front of the Battle of Panipat. And he also had his musketeers, soldiers with, you could say, prototype weapons. He had his siege weaponry. He had advanced firearms on his side. And he was the first one, like we said, to employ this type of military hardware in the region with his wagon fortresses. So he was at an advantage despite the numerical disadvantage. And then you could just imagine, you've got Ibrahim Lodi, and his main vanguard of his force was made up of antiquated, clumsy elephant corps. Elephants were their tanks. Now, elephants were no match against Babar's musketeers and his artillery. The battle was over in 5 hours. 5 hours, and 100,000 troops had been completely routed, had been destroyed. He stood no chance, and Ibrahim Lodi was dead on the battlefield. Fun fact, actually, Ibrahim Lodi was the only Delhi Sultan to die in war on the battlefield for nearly 300 years, from 1200s all the way to 1500s, 300 years. He was the only one to die on the battlefield. Now Babar marched into Agra and Lodi and captured and seized these capital cities and makes himself comfortable. This, now we could say, is the early beginnings of the Mughal state. Unfortunately, he died in the year 1530. Without having politically consolidated all of his lands, he wasn't able to savor his success. To finish off with Babar. Babar was a man of varied interests. He was a poet, and at the same time, he was a musician. And to be fair, some people, they're quite shocked and surprised when they hear that Muslim leaders were musicians, and they had court musicians, they had court bands as well. Even Aurangzeb, Alamgir, had his court band as well. He outlawed music, but he still had his royal procession in his court. So again, it's just the reality. Just like today, you might find so many politicians and leaders of Muslim countries doing un-Islamic things. It was exactly the same then. You can't expect these people to be exemplary Muslims because they were just human beings and they were politicians. They weren't scholars. So for them to have just been Muslim nominally was, a great thing in and of itself. And to be fair, out of all the great Mughals, the most irreligious, and actually, spoiler alert, the only one to have actually apostatized and left the faith was Akbar. he was the most irreligious. You've got a spectrum. Akbar on this side. The rest of the four were in the middle. They were nominal Muslims. They acknowledged Islam as their inherited tradition. They, probably prayed here and there. They were a favorite Mughal pastime. They were addicted to two things: drinking and substance abuse, opium. Princes, princesses even, the emperors, the kings, they were all addicted. That was a favorite Mughal pastime. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Aurangzeb, who is without a doubt the most observant of Islam out of all the Mughals, greater and the lesser. So Babar was a calligrapher, he was an artist as well. And the first thing he did, his reign in Delhi was short-lived, but the first thing he did was he started to landscape all of these exotic Persian gardens in India, which he'd seen in Kabul and which he'd inherited from his Timurid dynasty, from his Timurid ancestry. And his most famous legacy has to be the Babarnama, which we've just introduced, which was an autobiography he'd written at the end of his life about his exploits. He was a memoirist. These were his diary entries. And this is actually the first ever Muslim autobiography. Imagine, it took nearly 900 years, more than 1,000 years. The first ever Muslim autobiography. It was written in Chagatai Turkish because that was obviously his native language. It's been translated into several European languages.
of Arabic. Now you're probably thinking, where does Arabic come into this? When the Muslims, in the early conquest, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ,
with the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the Persian lands were Islamized and they were Arabized as well, with the Umayyads especially. So the Persian language actually was heavily influenced by Arabic. That's why in the modern Turkish language today, the Ottomans, you'll find they've got so many words which have crossovers with Urdu. And they have so many words which have crossovers with Arabic. Well, that's because all of these Turkic dynasties, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, they all spoke Persian as their official administration, as their official administrative language. And Persian was heavily influenced by Arabic. Lots of Arabic loan words as well. So now you've got this combination, this synthesis of languages. And over time, the national language became now a synthesis of all of these different languages used together to produce Urdu. Urdu, the word itself, Urdu, comes from a Chagatai Turkish word, ordu, with an O. And that means military encampment. That means a military garrison. So, in the Mughal army, you had the Chagatai Turks who brought their Turkish language. You had officials and generals who brought their Persian. Then you had the local Indians who brought their Sanskrit. All of them amalgamated, fused together to produce the Urdu language. That is probably one of the most successful, lasting legacies of the Mughals, which is inherited by everybody in India today. So you can see how important the Mughals were on a cultural level, and as we'll see later on an economic and a civilizational level as well. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspires us with true knowledge and He allows us to appreciate our Muslim history. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.